evening, everyone. So, welcome to this event, The Arts and the Public. It's the second in a series of debates on democracy and the arts in Europe that's been co-organised by Invoke Democracy and the Institute of Ideas Arts and Societies Forum in association with Rich Mix. I'm Claire Fox. I'm the director of the Institute of Ideas, and I was delighted to be asked to chair this discussion, which I think the big issue that lurks behind it is the issue of populism, which is obviously something that's very much at the forefront of our thinking and our thoughts over recent months, and is never out of the news. Too often, I think, we maybe use the word populist as an insult to delegitimise the unpopular, or to delegitimise the popular, and it's often said by people who are quite unpopular. But I think that, however, there is, some issues around populism and the arts that I would like us to explore tonight. We've all just witnessed what's happened in France, and I know that there's been great relief in many quarters about the result. But I was just interested, just in terms of this theme of the arts tonight, that the way that a lot of commentators have talked about Macron playing the Beethoven's Ode to Joy. And this was kind of posed very much as this shows, to quote, his intelligence, his civility, his culture and his openness. And this was compared to crassness, incivility, ignorance and closed-mindedness. And then went on to talk about the virtues of the EU. Now, I just would like to point out that Beethoven doesn't really belong to the EU and did exist before the EU. But I think there's a sort of tone in that we can all recognise. There's also been a new Banksy mural that has hit the walls of Kent. If you haven't seen it, it's a workman chipping away, removing a star from the EU flag, and then there's cracks appearing throughout the wall. Now, the thing that I wanted to quote from this, which is that Banksy is generally universally kind of lauded and applauded for his murals, but in this instance there's been a little backlash. And I wanted to just quote a tweet that the BBC quoted, because again I think it's pertinent to this evening, which says, "Another boring piece of art from the left-wing's favourite millionaire lovey." So you just think, oh, well, that's obviously a Brexiteer there. We all know what they're like. Anyway, goes on to say, "I'm a firm Remainer, but this patronising idiot makes you understand why people voted Leave." So I wanted to say at this point, by the way, that this evening is not about rehearsing what happened in the EU referendum again, and it's also not about us kind of shouting Remain or Leave or Brexit or Ramona or whatever at anybody that speaks. Because I think we have gone beyond that, but I do think it's a real attempt to sort of explore what's happening in the country, and I think that the arts are beginning to feel, that maybe that creative industries survey that indicated that 96% of the arts voted for Remain, that at least might mean that people in the arts would want to kind of take a look at the cultural sector and maybe worry slightly about whether there is an echo chamber. Grayson Perry has I've always wanted to stir things up, has argued that Brexit is a chance to reach new audiences, and says people are fed up of being told how to think and how to feel by us lot in our lovely Islington houses. And I think that he's trying to capture something that Rufus Norris, the artistic director at the National Theatre, also said. He said, "It's a very rich time to be an artist, but also an important time as an artist to make sure that you are thinking about subjects that are important to your audience, to be in touch, not to live in your bubble, to get out there. Otherwise, we become just a little place for entertainment and escape." Now, what I hope that we're going to do tonight is just talk about what are the arts, how does the arts relate to the public. There are people who, as we speak, are nervous that the arts are a bit out of touch, but then are kind of going on missionary work, sending the arts out to kind of get in touch with people, which might be even more frightening than anything else. So I think that's the kind of issue that we want to talk about. I'm going to introduce the panel now in the order in which they'll speak, and they've all been asked to kind of just give us an opening provocation of 6 or to 8 minutes each. Then we'll have a quick chat here, and then it's really very much a toing and froing with you, the audience. So we're going to hear first from Vicky Hayward, CBE, who's chair of the Royal Society of Arts, who has a background in theatre, having been the executive director at the Royal Shakespeare Company, previously joint chief executive at the Royal Court Theatre, and has had influential roles and continues to have influential roles in many cultural organisations, including the Society of London Theatres and the London 2012 Cultural Olympiad. Great to have you here, Vicky. Can we give her a warm welcome? Next, we're going to hear from Miriam Elia, who is a visual artist, a Sony-nominated surreal comedy writer, which is surreal even as I say it. She graduated from the Royal College of Art in 2006. Her work includes illustrated books such as We Go to the Gallery, which is one of the books that I adore and love, and also We Learn at Home, as well as prints, drawings, short films, radio comedy, and animations. Great to have you here, Miriam. So can we give her a warm welcome? Next, we'll be hearing from Angus Kennedy at the end there. Angus is the author of Being Cultured in Defence of Discrimination, I think one of the best books on the arts at the moment. He's the founder and convener of the Institute of Ideas educational initiative, The Academy, which he established in 2011. His interest is that he writes on the arts and on the philosophy of freedom, and he earns his living in information technology management consultancy, where he might earn a living, whereas previously he worked at the Institute of Ideas where he didn't. But anyway, it's great to have you here, Angus. And finally, we'll be hearing from Aves Mohammed, who is a project manager at the think tank British Future, which I think is actually one of the most interesting think tanks around that I've been following over recent years. He's done some fantastic work. Aves is a writer and a poet who has written widely for performance and print. His poetry is influenced by the Sufi saints of South Asia as much as by dub poets of Jamaica. His writings and essays explore themes such as integration and culture, and many of his plays depict the fallout of post-9/11 world. Aves. Okay, so Vicky, can you kick us off, please?
Thank you very much, Carol. The role of the artist and the arts after Brexit will go on as the arts before Brexit. It's inevitable that the world around us influences the work of artists and the art that is made. In a world of rising nationalism, racism, religious intolerance, and isolationism, creativity, which by its nature is inclusive, collaborative, and egalitarian, will need to consider carefully how it responds. I don't blame any one event for the increases I referred to. This is a drift. This is not a singular moment. It's crass and irresponsible to declare that the Brexit campaign or the Brexit vote created the rise of racial and religious intolerance in the UK or in Europe today. And it's crass and irresponsible to say that's what motivated people for Britain to leave. But rise it does. The facts are the facts. And because of this drift, artists and arts funders will need to consider their role in how this new world order, this drift, has come about. Measuring the haves and the have-nots applies just as much to creative education, the opportunity to experience the work of artists, and the opportunity to live a creative life. I suspect that the higher percentages of arts funding by Arts Council and local authorities congregates in the areas that have, rather than in the areas that have not. The role of the artist is to reflect, and you cannot reflect without being of your time. It is impossible to create art that is not of its time. Never mind great artists, look at yourself. Your child's picture on the fridge, your photo of your mother, the egg cup your father made at school, the doodle on your desk notepad. Every piece of creativity captures its time. I heard a voice on the radio. I wasn't really concentrating. It said, "The trouble with you British is you learn nothing from your own history. You think it's all behind you. Look at Scotland." To quote James Baldwin, the great force of history comes from the fact that we carry it within us, are unconsciously controlled by it in many ways, and history is literally present in all that we do. It could scarcely be otherwise, since it is to history that we owe our frames of reference, our identities, and our aspirations. Those of us that remember our history remember the significance of a united Europe that created a flag made of stars, which visualized the circle of unity. No one who remembers their history can ignore the significance of the message of Banksy's latest artwork in Dover. Art is about reflecting many, many things, but reflecting history and emotionally engaging you with your history is simply what it does. It is incapable of not doing this. This is what makes art political, and it's what makes art dangerous. To write, to compose, to choreograph, to paint, the artist's work forms and sets in the time that it was made. Just as importantly, you, the audience, view it in the time that you are, the present, and again in the future. When you view a piece of art, you're looking at a piece made in a time that has passed. Just passed or long gone. You're looking at it now, and now, and now. And with each reflection it changes because you have changed. It's not the artist that's political, it's you. I'm chairman of an organisation called 1418 Now, which is a government initiative to create art in all art forms to commemorate the centenary of the First World War. Over 30 million people have participated in our creative projects, over 210 artists, over 35 countries. Inspired, inventive, popular, celebratory in the same way that a memorial service is celebratory and reflective of a person's life. Respectful, educational, upsetting, uncomfortable, and emotional. It engages you emotionally with your history, your humanity, your human responsibility. Your feelings become entangled in a human tragedy. A tragedy so great that it's easy to distance yourself from it until a piece of art catches you in the throat or catches you in the heart. A 5-year-long reflection on an appalling human tragedy, a catastrophic failure of humanity. A catastrophic failure of unity, solidarity, and harmony, the other interpretation of the circle of stars. The world in 2014, when we started out, was very different to the world today. By the time we finish, it will be 2018. That is when the Art Commission stops, but the world will move on. It's impossible to know what our artworks will look like in 2028. We will reflect then, and we will consider our new history. The role of the artist in Europe after Brexit remains the same, but the world is very, very different. Thank you.
I'm an artist, so I don't prepare. I grew up in North London. You know, both parents very liberal. Dad's a Syrian refugee. That's cool. They didn't know what to call me. For 3 months I was just untitled when I was a baby. That's pretty cool. When I got to adolescence it was untitled with tits. So, you know, I had a fully liberal, open-minded childhood. At my childhood birthday parties we used to play pin the tail on the abstract donkey. So you didn't know where to put the tail, it was just abstract. Or my mum used to play post-Brexit Pat and his mixed-race cat. That's funny. Or she'd sing us, when you're happy and you know it, ask yourself why. So I totally understand why people would remain in the EU, because I'm from there. And then I went and voted Brexit, so I've had to spend the last year hiding in a bin. And it was only today that I went online and said, I voted Brexit. So, and I'm really, really proud of my choice, because I did it because I thought the EU was an undemocratic organisation, and I don't want to vote for an undemocratic organisation. But then obviously everybody I knew was bandering around with, you know, you're a racist, you're a sexist, you're a homophobe. So I thought maybe I was. But I'm not. So that's my view on it, and a lot of my work, it's not, the way I think and talk is different to writing notes, but that's kind of where I was coming from. So I'm out in the open. I voted Brexit. Yeah! Write that down, text it to your friends, put it on Twitter. Marie Millier voted Brexit. She's a racist! No, it's about democracy. And that's my final line in it. I'll hand you across.
Thank you very much, Miriam. I look forward to interrogating you far deeper, especially on the donkey. Oh, I'm allowed to do whatever I want. Okay, Angus, your thoughts?
I wanted to start with a sort of pre-referendum quote from Anish Kapoor, because I thought it sort of summed up why I think the two factors that really determine the relationship of a lot, not all, but a lot of the cultural arts community to the Brexit question. And sort of he was throwing his hands up pre-referendum, trying to influence the vote for Remain, saying Brexit would be a disaster because London's a great place for the art world, but most buyers aren't English. Of course not, said the multimillionaire artist, wondering what Brexit might mean for the economy of the art world. So there's a concern on the one hand that Brexit might not be bad for his bank balance. And secondly, and I think the two things go together and maybe reinforce them. Secondly, he added that anti-global sentiment, the rising tide of nationalism and, I nearly said rationalism, the rising tide of nationalism and racism that Vicky says she sees, he said that this anti-global sentiment was one of those things that goes against the flow of history. Frankly, nationalism diminishes ourselves, and we didn't pay any attention to him and promptly went out to vote for breakfast and diminished ourselves and possibly his bank balance too. I haven't checked if that's been the impact, though largely speaking the economy seems to have coped with Brexit so far. And I think this quote summed up for me where we are because there are two things going on. One, I don't think it's any particular surprise that the arts community was so surprised by Brexit because in a way it just doesn't get out enough. Despite the endless outreach programs and desire to get outside London and talk to the communities, clearly that has not worked because people in the arts world were so surprised. So despite all their talk of inclusivity and pluralism, it is a very sort of insular world in which people exist a bit in a sort of arts bubble. So I think that's one side of the problem, and to the extent that people have been shocked by Brexit, I would recommend that not that they go out and do more outreach programs to talk to the real people and ask them how they're feeling, because that would be dreadful, but they just might ask why it is that they were so surprised and do a bit of soul searching and take some time out, properly out, because artists should be in a bubble in a way, not just reinforcing their prejudices, but soul-searching, reflecting on the world that they live in, asking what it is, what it means, and finding ways to try and represent it as art. I think that's half the problem. I think the other half is that it's sort of no surprise that the arts community would so broadly identify with Remain, because for 100 years at least, the arts broadly, crude generalization, but broadly, have identified themselves as being modern, and fresh, not old or dusty. They've consciously broken with artistic tradition. They've aimed to be shocking, to offend bourgeois sensibilities, to be transgressive, to be diverse, to be multicultural, to be global, and so on. To be like Miriam's mum. And to the extent that they do that, so does the EU, which defines itself as being anti the dusty and bloody history of nationalism, you know. And this is Jean-Claude Juncker's position, that the greatest problem we face are national borders. And so the other campaigners in the arts world for Remain all pushed the same message, whether it was Tacita Dean's carefully scribbled chalkboard message saying, vote for a future, not a past. Bob and Roberta Smith put all their combined intelligence into saying, vote for Europe, we've only got each other, which is sort of fridge magnet philosophy. And Michael Craig Martin, true to his sort of shtick, so every Leave vote is a vote against prosperity, against peace, against the democracy that the EU guarantees, and the rule of law, human rights, civil liberties, and presumably the price and size of bananas as well. And so I think, of course, they threw their lot in with Remain, because they are anti the virtues of tradition, of anything settled, of belonging, and in particular anti, as the cosmopolitan sellers in a global art market that they are, anti the nation state. So they were always wedded to EU projects. Wolfgang Tillmans probably was the clearest expresser of this view, with his campaign poster saying, if people like Rupert Murdoch, Nigel Farage, George Galloway, Nick Griffin, and Marine Le Pen want Britain to leave the EU, where does that leave you? On the side of the racists or on the side of the angels, presumably. What am I doing for time? And I suppose I sort of disagree with Vicky's position in a way, which is that there may be something of a nationalist backlash happening. There may be resentment against the EU's denial of democracy. There may be resentment against a kind of very broad sort of rejection of all the virtues of home in the broadest sense. Just one example I was thinking of was the split in 2000 between when the Tate split into Tate Britain and Tate Modern, which is sort of a neat sort of couplet in which the renaming tells us that whatever is modern is not British, and whatever is British is not modern. And of course, the collections in Tate Modern have been very much steered to exclude British artists in favour of internationalism. I think that's an example, that a much longer running example of a relentless rise of politicized diversity, which may be breeding a reaction. But I think that's been the problem, the politicization of diversity, the relentless search for what we haven't got in common, rather than anything to say what might bind us together. And I think if people have been surprised by that in the arts community, then I do think they've got a real responsibility as artists, as sort of honest people, I suppose, to examine this question and say maybe there be a problem with diversity. And after that, ask the question and they still don't agree, fair enough. But I think it gets taken on face value too much. And of course some of it is taken on face value because it's a route into a gravy train of EU funding. If your project's on the troubles of transgender immigrants, that's a certain bet. If it's on the values, espousing the values of patriotism in British, traditional art, then probably it's not. So I think I'll just sort of leave it there. I think those were the two main things for me that are worth debating: the extent to which the arts are anti the nation state, and so is the EU, and the extent to which they have been overtaken by the politicization of diversity to the detriment of their art.
Good evening. So I'm going to interrogate this statement: achieving great art and culture for everyone. It's supposed to be our sector's collective ambition and governing principle. How, though, my question today, is this lofty ideal to be impacted by the fragmented landscape we find ourselves in today? I believe Brexit ushers in an important time in which to begin a new debate upon diversity. How exactly should the cultural sector respond to the challenges of our post-Brexit society? This isn't the same as asking the question, which side were you on last June? Most of us are probably fed up with hearing about those suspect metropolitan elites, the privileged few so densely packed into their liberal bubble they've become unable to see the greater swathes of society who don't share their views. The charge is at you, we, are part of the problem, when we'd want to be part of the solution. A strong instinct, then, is to double down on liberal values, defending tolerance and diversity, and standing up for the multi-ethnic, multi-faith society we enjoy today and work hard to preserve. I certainly want to defend those values, but as wholly and entirely as possible by extending these same principles of tolerance and openness to accommodate the leavers of Boston and Thurrock as much as the remainers of Haringey and Hackney. I don't believe 1/3 of this culture, of this country, is driven by xenophobic ideas. I don't believe seeking an honest conversation about the impact of immigration and what integration really means amounts to being racist. I do believe that now, more than ever, we need to listen and understand all perspectives in a safe and open manner. Because at the core of it, the key question here is, do we polarize or do we depolarize? We believe in the power of culture to bridge divides, to bring people together, to promote understanding, and most of all, to relate with people and experiences we may never have an opportunity to do otherwise. This is what we do. And this is what we continually seek to do better. But at the same time, we need to ask ourselves whether we're going to be up to this task. If too many of us, the cultural producers, decision makers, the curators, and the artists, and too often most of our audiences too, come from one pole of an argument that we're seeking to depolarize. That's not to say we can't be part of the solution, but only if we think harder about how. There's another assumption in much public discourse I also want to challenge today. For too long in our thinking around diversity, race and class seem to have been either or options, often in competition with each other. Brexit itself has broadened the debate, but the risk is it could now lead to a series of contests about which integration debate matters most. Can instead the opportunity be taken to do what is long overdue by linking questions of ethnicity, faith, gender and social class in a coherent debate about what equal opportunities and shared identity in Britain should mean? My key argument today is we need to integrate all the separate debates we're having about integration and diversity. Debates upon race, faith, gender and class, if we're to effectively engage with our stated aim of great art and culture for everyone. Because for too long in our efforts for inclusion, we've excluded class. So how then do we provide programming that works for us all without resorting to archaic seasonal slots where each community awaits its 15 minutes of fame? Again, my argument is not for a change in resource or structure, but a change in attitude. Giving a share of the platform to minority voices to tell minority stories meant for minority audiences may have been a necessary stepping stone for previous generations. But it also affirmed that special provision, a special narrative was needed to engage minorities that was for them alone and not the mainstream. Unfortunately, this approach to curating still exists and will continue to exacerbate difference until we move away from them and us narratives, the one that engage us all. The them and us frame entrenches artists, curators, audience development departments into static engagements with identity, whereas the us all frame provides encouragement to not just acknowledge people from other communities, but consider how we're all impacted by each other's narratives. In my own career as a playwright, I've become accustomed to writing and being expected to write plays that deal with the British Muslim extremism against a backdrop of Islamist extremism. Admittedly, this is entirely self-initiated. Though for my last plays, Hurling Rubble at the Sun and Hurling Rubble at the Moon, I've chosen to focus upon the simultaneous development of British Muslim and white far-right extremism, demonstrating their entwined and conjoined relationship. My choice to tell the story of the other community, of white working class grievance and its development into extremism, allowed me to fully acknowledge that this too was my story, an experience I'd rubbed shoulders with and also knew intimately. What seemed like minority narratives have relevance to a wide range of communities, including the majority, and acknowledging as much can help build a shared vision of who we all are and how we relate to one another. A shared vision we desperately need today. This is a historic time, right now, this moment, upon which to restart the debate of how cultural institutions can adapt their approaches to integration. I feel we should take these 2 years of uncertainty and transition as a challenge for this sector. Not just to deepen our debates, but to take practical action too. To depolarize our country, to integrate class into our integration debates, and to develop narratives and exhibitions capable of speaking to us all, not just them or us. Thanks.
You raised some great points there, Alice. So listen, I'm just going to quickly whiz round each of the speakers. I mean, Vicky, because you spoke first, obviously there's things you might want to come back on. But so feel free to come back on anything you've heard. But one of the things I wanted to, I suppose, to ask you was just that point you made about the arts reflecting things. And I suppose that was my hint at the beginning with, is that if the arts are so sensitive and have got the finger on the pulse and reflecting things, why did there seem to be such a chasm between the arts and millions of people? It wasn't I anticipated that they'd change their mind politically. I just mean in terms of a kind of that gap. What do you reckon?
I think you've got to really watch a few vast generalisations here, because we're in danger of slightly muddling up what art is and the creative process and why people engage in it either as artists or as audiences. And a political conversation that's going on at the moment about how we want to live our lives. And I think to confuse those two things is in danger, really, of rather minimising what the artist's relationship is with its art. I mean, this country happens to have an audience right across the country that participates in all kinds of artistic and creative activity more than many other countries in the world. So we mustn't fall into a trap of saying, oh, artists are all over here on one side and all the general public are in another place. I don't believe that's true. And actually, if you look at who is consuming art in this country and creating art in this country, it's a broader picture than I think is being portrayed. That said, I think you are absolutely right. And with everything, if you chase the money, you find the answer. And I think the big reveal moment, which should never have surprised anybody, but kind of did, is that map that was drawn of where the money is spent and how money is invested in arts and creativity in the UK. And it is far too centred on the south, and it is far too centred on certain metropolitan areas. Now, there's a big push to change that, and I think it was a big wake-up call both for artists themselves and also for arts funders to really see that. And yeah, Brexit was part of that wake-up moment. But I think if you talk to an individual artist about why they create their work and the relationship they want to have with the people who are experiencing it, that is not limited, and that is not a political big P conversation. That's a much broader, deeper relationship than that.
Yeah, go on.
Sorry. Yeah. For one, sorry, there are 2 points that I just like to interrogate further. The idea that artists aren't on one side and the rest of the public on the other, I disagree with that a little. I mean, the data that we're showing today is on the 96 or 98%, I thought it was, of people in the cultural sector that voted to remain. That's not to say that they can't take that step forward to accommodate the other opinion, but at the same time, I'm quite surprised, as an artist myself, how my peers and even other artist platforms in which I've shared this same paper, the number of artists that have equated the Leave vote with a gesture of racism or as a gesture of fascism. And so when I'm advocating for the fact that as artists, our role is to have the diversity of voices and opinions in our country on our stages so we can share and interrogate them more broadly, the knockback I'm getting is, we fought hard to keep those opinions out of our spaces and we won't let them in now. So I'm not sure that that's entirely the vision of the arts sector that we live in today.
I just wanted to pose, I was asked to speak at an interesting panel, a very interesting project by a theatre in London who put on, and commissioned and put on a short series of very short plays, on Trump's election, trying to imagine why people voted Trump, which was a very brave initiative, and then had a panel discussion at which I spoke. I suppose even braver. But the thing that was really interesting was that the audience kept laughing at the characters who were meant to be. Do you know what I mean? It was it was very difficult for anyone to kind of do it. I mean, it wasn't just the performers; it was the audience as well. Was that every time anyone would kind of try and explain in a play why they voted Trump, they want to start laughing, especially if they had a funny American accent and blonde. No, but the reason I'm saying it is, and then a lot of the writers said, we're finding it hard to make this work because we all share the same assumptions. Whereas what we were trying to do was to try and understand why people voted Trump. We can't quite get past the fact that none of us understand. And I suppose that's one of the sort of prejudices, I suppose, that I was trying to draw attention to. Miriam, then Angus.
Well, I just wanted to ask Vicky something, actually, as well. Just, can you clarify, because maybe it's slightly different from your question, and I don't want to caricature yours, but isn't it sounding a bit like a sort of the Heineken approach to arts funding? You know, what is the magic that for arts funding to reach the places that some arts funding can't reach? And so it's a sort of response saying, oh, the arts funding didn't work because people voted the wrong way. Let's find the right way to make sure they vote the right way next time.
I think what's problematic here is that we seem to be having a conversation about the ways in which people voted in terms of one day on one particular situation, and the way in which artists and audiences work together to create a piece of art. And I'm not quite sure that the analogy is correct. If you seem to be saying that because the vast percentage of artists who were asked, I wasn't, said that they were voting to support Remain, that means in some way or another they were totally out of touch with the country. I don't think those two things relate together at all. I do believe that we have issues around artists being in connection with their audience, but that isn't just around the vote about Europe. That's a much, much broader set of connections that I think you're talking about that we really need to engage in. I've just created a piece of art recently, which was enjoyed by 63% of the UK population. I don't see a way in which the UK population is not enjoying engaging with art, and I don't see a world in which artists are not engaging with quite broad numbers of the population. So I don't experience a world that you experience of a sort of a reserved elite that has no relationship with its audience, and everybody who creates a piece of art does it, first of all, because they are driven and compelled to, but they do, honestly, if they had to admit it, want other people to enjoy that art. It is not a private process. It is naturally collaborative. It is naturally egalitarian. So I don't see a world where artists are isolated figures in ivory towers. I do see a world, which I think is the concerning world, where a lot of people are cut out from the opportunity of experiencing art, of experiencing creating education, of experiencing as an audience, and of making it. I think arts in this country are dangerously culturally exclusive. I don't think that's anything to do with the Brexit vote. I think that's to do with the challenge we face in society about how to broaden our world. Now, we might have different approaches about how to broaden the world, but I don't see that as being a conversation about whether you want to be in or out of the EU.
Miriam, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, no, I was just thinking that, why did people vote for Donald Trump? Why did people vote for Brexit? And for me, it's actually quite clear. I mean, since I was about 21, most of my peers, and I went to art school and all that, most of my peers spent just every now and again, they go, look at that chav. Look at that working class person. Let's be totally honest, there's total contempt for the working class. They've been screwed over, and of course they're going to vote for someone that gives them hope and optimism. And as far as I can see, the liberal arts establishment have completely rejected them. They've been sneering at them. They've been devaluing their nation state or whatever is dear to them, and trying to kind of impose something on people that they don't really want. They don't want to listen. And that kind of prejudice is still there. It's not gone away anywhere. You can talk about, I'm a socialist and I care about people and I love people. I want the arts to be inclusive and I want everyone to come to my art show and reach out to people. But that's crap. It's not true. It's not the real feeling is a contempt, particularly for the white British working classes. And they are, if you can spend 10 years, you just go on television, watch every panel show. They just go, UKIP, 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 UKIP. That's going to make them even more angry because they're just not being heard. And
can I?
They're being sneered at. They're being just completely, yeah.
Okay, because I want to go out to the audience. A minute. Can I just press you a bit, Angus, on something that you were talking about, which is quite confusing, but also, you know, you were emphasising this kind of rejection of British art, or you know, kind of, and a lot of enthusiasm for cosmopolitan. And I know this was the theme of the last discussion, kind of the idea that arts is without boundaries, is cosmopolitan, is international, and so on. And what I want to know, were you saying those as kind of boo words as well? Because obviously one of the aspects of the arts that I'm enthusiastic about, at least, is that there is a kind of boundarylessness in as much as they're universal. You know, so you don't think of, oh, that's the French, you don't think that's a great French play, even though it might be French, but you think it's a great play. That's all I'm saying is, could you kind of just kind of untangle that a bit? Because I was confused about what you were saying there.
I think there are borders or boundaries of judgment, if nothing else, around a canon of artistic tradition. They may not be national ones, and they aren't really. They're broadly Western European, Anglo-American tradition, and it is universal. Other things have been and can be taken up into it, and that's always been the case. But it is bounded by, crudely, is the piece of work in question any good or not? And what I was trying to allude to in a completely uncomplicated way is that I think in the last 100 years, there's been a thoroughgoing rejection of that tradition by the arts world, in literature, in music, in the visual arts as well. And it's been a successful rejection. There has been a destruction of the values and judgments of that tradition. And so people are now in a position of not being anywhere, you know, bereft, without home, and trying to make the best of it by saying who wanted to be at home anyway, but really being in a position of kind of awful existential loneliness.
But if I can just ask you, though, in relation to what Vicky was saying, because, you know, Vicky makes a point, which is, are we over-interpreting this? You know, just because a survey says 96%, this many people voted Brexit. I mean, you know, it doesn't matter whether artists voted Remain or to leave or not. What does that mean? It's a one-off moment. Is this overplaying the point? This idea of a kind of aloof artistic elite. That's the point, is because that can be just as much of a sneer as anything else.
I mean, I sort of think that artistic elite should be elitist and aloof and distant insofar as they're concentrating on doing their art, and they should bracket out the things that have got nothing to do with the art, and they should be elitist in the sense that if they're trying to produce really good art, that's not rubbish art, so they're not anything goes artists. They're elitist in that sense. The only thing I find confusing about what Vicky's saying is, maybe it's just me not getting the point, but it's the concern with the audiences. So I would like the artists to have a concern just with the art, and almost to hell what the people make of it. You know, it's the concern with engaging with audiences that I don't get. I think if the art's good, the audiences will come. If the art's rubbish, no amount of outreach is going to fix that problem.
Well, you might have something to say about that, but I was going to actually ask you, there was an interesting exchange on Start the Week this morning, which had Hanif Qureshi being extremely bitter and angry and saying the world's going to hell in a handcart, and, you know, there's the rise of, you know, all these terrible things. Anyway, there was a very interesting exchange because Kate Tempest, the performance poet, made a point that, you know, you really need to listen. And he wouldn't listen to her, never mind to anyone else. So. And then she said, well, you really should listen harder. And because he was sort of saying, yes, I'm listening and I'm hearing them, and I'm caricaturing. If you're in, kind of. But it really was like, I'm listening to them and I don't like what I'm hearing. Or if I'm going to listen to them, I'm going to change their mind. And she was saying, no, be quiet and listen harder. And he didn't understand, I don't think. And I thought it was very true of her to say it. But what it did make me think, was one of the issues that I've had over the years, not to do with Brexit, but it reflects it, is the politicization of art. You know, that art should do something. You know, should be political, should solve social problems, should go out and create a happier world. I mean, this is not to make the point about EU funding, but a lot of funding projects are, you know, we'll fund your art if it's going to bring around multicultural harmony. You know, if you're going to reduce teenage pregnancy, we had a whole spate of that for years. You get grants for that. I mean, that kind of thing. But political art was almost like the only art that counted. And I think that's actually not done art any favours, as it happens, because it's allowed art to kind of become politicised by the dominant political outlook of a, as it were, of the status quo. And that's one of the reasons why it's become removed from its own mission. Any thoughts on that?
A few thoughts. I think, art is not just one thing. It does many things. And one of the things that it does do, as well as hopefully tell a damn good story or, entertain, is it has the capacity for political change or social change or whatever you want, creating a better world or at least expressing the grievances of people. It's always had that since the time of the troubadours, since, before. It's been a social commentator. That's been part of it. And, I might buy that, that part of it has been injected with steroids with EU funding. But this is actually coming to another point, which is that, coming from, I suppose, an experience where I've perhaps felt comfortable calling myself a British Asian artist at times, and a British Muslim artist less so at other times, I know that these movements, and there've been movements, haven't just occurred. They've been lobbied for. They've had to be lobbied for the resources to be shared and for these people to grow and venues like Tara and organisations like Tamasha to exist. What's been missing is that same lobby from the white working class perspective. And partly it's because, and this is where I kind of see Hanif Qureshi's side on this a little, in that generation does still equate the white working class voice of grievance with racism, because it experienced it as skinheads. It experienced it with that same, I suppose, with that caricature, which today has become a caricature, but I suppose in their age it wasn't. It was genuine. They were afraid of the white working class voice of what happens to us, what happens to our Englishness, because that was expressed in a way that was racist and violent when people at Hanif Qureshi were younger. However, let me just finish the point, though, surely. However, that's not the same Britain that we live in today. And I think the crux of the argument is that as long as we're only responsible for ourselves, so the British Asian artist only lobbies for British Asian work and writes British Asian work, and, the British African Caribbean artist will do the same for his community. As long as that exists, then this is surely just, an unending chasing the tail. What we should be doing, and I hope the artists are doing today, is building a shared narrative, one that we can all, the one that speaks to us all, and that can be owned by us all equally, and so we're not living in our silos and speaking for ourselves, and so we can represent the grievances and the, voices of others who don't necessarily look like us.
Okay, all sorts of things on the table, from identity politics. I started thinking about cultural appropriation as you were speaking. I mean, there's all sorts of disputes lurking around here. Right, who wants to speak? I'm going to take, 5 or 6 people, and then I'll just come and grab some thoughts from the panel.
Okay, thank you. So I'm a theatre student at the Royal Central School of Speech and Drama, and I'm very, very interested in spending my career working in Europe and working with European communities across the continent through arts. And to be honest, I'm a little bit disappointed by this discussion because it said on the advertising that it was supposed to be centered around the role of the arts in public debate about the future of Britain and Europe. But what the conversation seems to have become is about artists and their ability to connect to the British people without mentioning about how any of that relates to our place in Europe. And I'm a little bit annoyed at some of the comments that Miriam is making because it seems like you're stereotyping the working class a little bit. Whereas the fact is, in my class, there are a lot of working class people who are artists. There are a lot of working class people who also voted to remain in the EU for perfectly legitimate reasons. And even if you look at the politics of it, there are so many people who I know who are voting Labour. There are so many people I know who are voting UKIP. There are so many people I know who are voting Tory. I find it very difficult to sort of stick every member of the working class into a box and say, that that's the way that they are. And if there's one thing that Brexit taught us, is that that's not possible to predict that. Wait, I'm getting to the... I'm so sorry, I'm getting to the question, because we talked a lot about the EU being undemocratic, and I just want to ask anybody who wants to answer this question, what is it that you think we are able to do now that we have left the EU that we weren't able to do before?
Hi, I wanted to follow up on a point Vicky made right at the beginning about art being in the now, and then Angus's point about whether cultural elites across Western Europe have sort of abandoned any sense of a kind of shared cultural canon. I've been reading Douglas Murray's book all weekend, The Strange Death of Europe. I recommend it to everyone, even if you disagree with it. I think you'll find it hard to fault its lucidity. And he talks a lot about this and says one of the explanations factors around sort of unpopular, failed, difficult immigration policies is this sort of sense of shared guilt and shame and rejection of history. So he gives an example of a Swedish minister talking to an opening of a group of Kurdish refugees, saying, "Oh, I'm so jealous of your fantastic traditions and culture because we don't have anything like that in Sweden." And I just wondered if you had anything to say about, do you recognise that? And is there any way to have art in the now that still celebrates what we might all feel a bit conscious is a difficult history? Is there anything beyond Downton that's not equally sort of saccharine and two-dimensional like I, Daniel Blake?
Somebody mentioned nation and diversity. The thing with Britain, France, everywhere, is the fact that diversity is what built this nation. Diversity, one of the problems in education is that enslavement is left out of the narrative, and Tate Britain was built out of that. And so therefore we keep having this issue about diversity. Yet Britain is one of the most diverse places. It has been built on the history of diversity. The wealth that came into Britain was through that exploitation. And so therefore, and also, as a Caribbean artist, when I do my art, I cannot disassociate myself from my history, which is a history of colonization, which is a history of Britain's exploitation, taking the riches of my country and the rest of Africa, wherever, and building this nation. It is a nation of diversity, and if we begin not to leave that out of education, and that is one of the reasons we are having the problem with immigrants and diversity and everything else. This nation, Tate Britain, is an example of something that was built out of that exploitation.
I'm finding the attitude to artists very strange. The artists I know would never sneer at the working class people. The artists I know are struggling to live in this city, which gets more expensive by the day. The gravy train of European money, if you can get any, you're very lucky at all. The artists I know are not Anish Kapoor. They don't have that sort of funding. Most artists are engaging. They're not doing it as missionary work, as you mentioned, Claire. They're doing it out of a real deep keenness to make their work out of the so-called bubble. And I'm fed up with hearing this word elitist bubble. The artists I know are absolutely not elitist, and they are some of the most open, connected people. And this, for me, this Brexit vote is closing the doors. And actually, what if art does help reduce teenage pregnancies? What if art does actually help the plight of transgender refugees? Is that a problem? What else is going to help that? And the other point is, I think you'll find 90% of scientists are also very much staying in Europe. So it's not just this elitist bubble that's made this happen.
No, you're absolutely right. It is true that it's 96% of artists, 97% of scientists, and 98% of university academics. This does not necessarily speak to a kind of free-thinking, open-minded. And 48%. I'm just saying, yes, but I'm saying it's all forgotten. But no, not at all. I'm saying it's 48% versus a much higher majority. I'm just pointing out that it's not reflective of the population, rather than that it should be exactly the same as. Yes, so there's somebody got a mic.
A question for Vicky, but probably the panel in general. Does art have to be so involved with the past and identity in the way that you were kind of describing? So I'm thinking of, by way of counterexample, the Russian constructivists tapped into and expressed a desire for hope and were trying to sketch out a vision of a new future, very much riding on the energy of the Russian Revolution. So now, it would be ahistorical to say that Brexit is the Russian Revolution, because that's obviously not true. But to me, it does suggest that there is a latent or kind of unexpressed desire for something new that is not being paralleled in the arts. So why is there that gap? Why can it not express a desire for something that's not there?
Okay, so is there anything you want to pick up from the audience so far? Just any of the questions that you want to come back on? One or two?
Yeah, something the lady over there said about how as an artist you are obviously influenced by your heritage and your history, and I completely agree and acknowledge that. And I have been myself, and probably still will be, for the future. But also there's a responsibility, I feel, to engage with the present and how the present is going to shape the future. And I think sometimes we just need to be aware of how our work is the impact it's going to have on the range of audiences. I feel sometimes that work that can be created, that talks about empire and slavery and colonization, can isolate audiences rather than bring them together. Ultimately, slavery is a British story. It's not just a well, yeah, it's not. But in this context, it's a British story, as in it belongs to us all. It doesn't just belong to one community to tell it. It's relevant for us all, as is colonization. And surely the impact of telling this story should be to speak to us all in a way that doesn't isolate, but potentially that could bring us together and have lessons, the lessons learned from it rather, shape a future.
I'd like to come back on the first question, which, if I got it right, was what are we able to do in Europe now that we were not able to do before? What has Brexit enabled us to do? And I would argue that it has enabled us to really start to show what matters, because I think the conversation has become polarized. So if you're talking about as an artist, as a creative person, I think that if you traveled through Europe right now, you would find yourself in a conversation about a big misunderstanding, many would say a major misunderstanding, about what the message was that came from the British people when it voted to leave Europe. And I think that you would become engaged in pubs and bars and on stages doing comedy acts and in theatres, and if you're making a film, in addressing that very issue. So I think that's what's changed about what would happen to you as an artist if you started travelling right now through France and Germany and Spain. And that really takes me to the point at the back, which is I believe you cannot avoid but create your work in the time that you are in. You are influenced by the time that is behind you, and you are looking forward. You may have very specific government interventions that will push you in a certain direction, as the one, and I think maybe you're referring to the recent exhibition at the RA, which was a fascinating examination, I thought, of what happens to a group of artists who are required to create art to meet a particular a position that the government wishes them to take. And wow, was it an incredible exhibition. So all art is created within its time, and what I was therefore saying, which I hope was answering the question we were asked to look at, was that artists going forward are going to address Brexit. They're bound to, or rather, let's forget about Brexit. Artists going forward are going to address a world where Europe has taken one particular position and the UK has taken another. I also believe artists are going to be addressing a position of what's going on between England and Scotland. I mean, you can't not start to look at that. And I also believe they'll be influenced, as we know, as I said right at the beginning, by the rise and the big concern that we all have in this country about the increasing crime rate in terms of racism and religious bigotry. It's a fact. It's just a fact that it's happening, and we all have to deal with it in one way or another, and artists will have a response to that I hope will be helpful.
Okay, Miriam, anything anyone said you want to come back on?
Well, there will be one person. Sorry, what was your name? Finn. Hi, Finn. Sorry that I made you angry. You said I made you angry, but no, my opinion is that there is a certain amount of contempt, yes. And even though in your drama class there are people of all different backgrounds, I think that's fantastic. I mean, I've been working at an art school for about 2 years, just teaching, and because of basic government cuts and the fact that I think the kids are paying like 10 grand a year, it's basically economically it's wiping out anyone from a poorer background to come to art school. Most of my students now are from upper middle class or very wealthy families, and it's almost like a finishing school for them. Well, I've actually just quit because I need to go back to my own studio. But it was a 1 day a week thing where I get out of my studio and get to meet, work in art schools. No, but that is a problem. So no, I'm not going to go back on that. I do think that there is a disconnect. Yeah.
Okay, Angus.
Well, there's a million things, but I think the point made by the lady here on my front left about, maybe the lady on the back right should read Douglas Murray's book about relationship with history and so on. But to tie this back to the arts, I think slavery is not a uniquely British institution, but abolishing it was. Now that's part of Britain's history that doesn't seem to get as much airplay as Britain's colonial history. I think if you want to be interested in history, you have to take the rough with the smooth and look at all of it, rather than the bit that fits your agenda, crudely put. And for artists, I think they don't just reflect the way things are now, but they try, insofar as they're artists, to make works of art that are worth preserving, that will speak to future generations about the world that we lived in, what it was like for the artist, and what that world was like. So Shakespeare was a man of his time, and there are certain anti-Semitic tropes in his work. But nonetheless, you can say of Shylock that that he's a man as well as a Jew, and that he bleeds like other men. And that is something that speaks to us much longer than just looking at what the elites of 17th century England was like. So I think the arts have got into a difficult position, because the point about my Caribbean art sort of speaks to the problem that I'm trying to identify, is that art stops being universal. It speaks to a particular concern of, in this case, experience of slavery, not personal, I hope. And it doesn't speak to universal values. And that's just a real problem. There isn't an easy I think you're dead right about the Downton example, or, Prince Charles lauding Poundbury and sort of throwback attempts to be traditional. There's a very real and difficult problem, which is how can the arts be traditional in the reality of the destruction of tradition? It has been destroyed. There's no going back to it. But I think artists, if they're good artists, should be examining that question.
That's very sad.
Yeah, go on, say something. Yeah.
I was just coming back to about your about this. Oh, sorry.
No, you carry on, Miriam.
Just about the guilt narrative. Do you think that suffocates any kind of optimism post-Brexit? Yeah.
Okay, so I've got there and then there. Yeah, those two there.
Okay, sorry, Finn, I think you might get upset with me as well, but we can, have a pint later and sort it out. Because I agree with Miriam. I resonate with the sneering. Put my cards on the table, play my identity card. I grew up white and working class in council estate in the 1970s. Not really that now, because I went on and got a few humanities degrees. But I think the flip side of that sneering in the arts world is patronising.
Yes. Yeah.
And when I was reaching out to try and understand that world of imagination, understanding the art. What I didn't want was anybody coming round to include me or to share my narrative.
Like you're a Furby.
Like I'm a Furby, or have a safe space for me. I wanted that vision of art. I wanted that resistance where it's difficult. Take me into it, challenge me, let me grapple with that art, and that helped me to have the judgment of art that Angus has spoken about, maybe. I certainly didn't want anyone coming around the tower block saving me in art from my teenage pregnancy. I could do that myself, thank you very much. But what I would like to hear as well is, and it doesn't matter if that place of imagination of great art is coming from British Asian point of view or Assyrian, or that is the spark of it. But that universal moment when it astounds you, it challenges you, it unsettles your world. Can we please argue for that? That matters. It might not be for everybody, but for the people who engage with that, grapple with it, it matters. That's what art is.
Okay, so this gentleman then next.
Yeah, I mean, I tend to agree with that sentiment. I was going to say that as a consumer of art, I'm not really in the business of production, but as a consumer of art, I'm actually troubled by the lack of politicization of art, and in fact that maybe in a London that's becoming more and more globalized, that actually the driving force for the production of art is global capitalism, and what art can sell for the most money to whoever's investing in that, and a result of that can be a lack of politicization, because that type of political art can be seen as dangerous, and then people don't want to spend their money on that. So kind of getting a bit of a grey aesthetic niceness that maybe it's nice to look at, but possibly doesn't really do anything beyond that.
I think we just need to look at Rotherham to see exactly what happens to the working class voiceless people. And in the middle class arena, they're shunned. I've experienced similar things. If you don't fit in, people will take you and smile at you and accept you if they think you're one of them. And I've experienced this many times. But if they find out you have a history of some kind, any kind, amongst British people, they'll reject you. We're the most discriminatory people that, apart from the protected groups.
Yeah, I think just one thing that has been missed by a lot of people in the Brexit vote is just the spirit, the rebellious spirit that it represented. And I think that's, so if you look at, you look at comedians, a lot of comedians, if you listen to the Now Show on Radio 4 or watch Mock the Week, where's the satire? The real biting satire, because we live in massively turbulent times, and yet the comedy that seems to come out of it seems to be very, very conformist, and either pities the working class, pities other people different from them, or fears them. So that there seems to be, the rebellious spirit of punk, or the new sort of alternative comedy that happened in the 80s, or what have you. It seems that people have missed that actually what drove a lot of people to vote for Brexit was that things are done to them all the time, and then when they complain about it, they're laughed at and sneered at, and it was their one chance to say, fuck you, right? We're voting against you lot because we believe in ourselves, and it's rebellious.
Yeah.
So
and they're sick of being called far right as well. That is an absolute travesty that anybody that... Sorry.
But it's just, I think if you miss the rebellious spirit, it then makes you fearful of those people and the consequences of all these things, and therefore you lose your critical faculties because you're frightened of what could become, rather than be explorative, intellectually stimulated, intellectually curious, play with stuff. So that's not reflected in what people are writing, the comedy they're doing, the plays they're doing, in the cultural output. So all the people who should be putting out this fantastic cultural output, there should be dramas on the telly and film, all sorts of stuff. There seems to be a dearth of it. And then it's filled with a very conformist vacuum.
Yeah.
Sorry, I know it's a gross generalisation.
No, Vicky wants to come back quickly, so yeah.
Just quickly, I hope this rebellious feeling is going to continue into the next election. There is an opportunity to vote again coming up very soon, so I'll be interested to see how the rebellion goes. Who is controlling the voice and how that voice is getting out, I think, is a very important point. And there is a role here that is not being fulfilled, I believe, by the BBC. I think it's might be waking up a tiny bit to it, but not really. And it's the point I was making really about arts funding and how that's been working and who's making the decisions about where that money is going. I think these are incredibly important points. Access to voice is about money. Access to power is about money. And too much money has been rooted and not gone to the right place. There is an interesting thing, though, about turbulent times. It's a funny thing, but there is a correlation between a lack of response and turbulence. There is an odd thing about that. And actually, if you look at very turbulent times in Northern Ireland, you look at certain countries where life is very turbulent, you look at places in the world, let's come out of Europe for a minute, let's look at what's really going on around the world and how tough it is for people and artists. You know, artists I know who are in Baghdad right now. It's very hard to come up with stuff when life's really screwy, you know? And so there is an odd kind of delay factor that does happen. So one just has to kind of watch that. It's not just because people are sitting at home not thinking about it. It's actually about how do I respond to some stuff in very turbulent moments in world history. It takes quite a lot of time and reflection for people. That's just a thing that's happened.
Right, there's quite a few hands, so I'm going to try and take as many as I possibly can.
Okay, thank you. So I think in terms of this working class thing, and I'll talk about that and also the appropriation of rebellion. I'll phrase those as two examples. I think using America, so I think it's slightly different over here, because over here you do have a certain, contempt, I think, but also this appropriation of the working class as well in this drive for authenticity and regional accents on TV and all that. But in America, if you take the working class community of the Deep South, who really are despised, there's a lot of liberals now trying to understand why people voted Trump. But in terms of going back to this colonial narrative, the narrative of the Deep South is all about slavery, but the majority of white people in America did not own slaves, and their understanding of history is completely different. So how do you, would it be possible in today's climate to have an art project that reflected the experience of white Southern Americans historically and present it in a positive way? My second issue is on the old, is with the appropriation. I've noticed with the American right is they do tend to appropriate symbols in a very ironical way, and then people on the left will take it literally and think that they're white supremacists, but they're reflecting that in an ironical way, in like the way they appropriate symbols. You may have heard, if you're sufficiently nerdy, of the Peppy the frog meme and all that, and they've managed to effectively troll the left in a very hilarious way. I think that's something that someone could do, and that someone could explore the art history of that.
Thank you. That's interesting. Look, I'm going to try and get through people. There's a couple of things. First of all, I wouldn't mind us having some reflection on Europe. That would be good. Because the person made the point that was actually the theme of the first discussion, as it happens. This is much more on the populism one, but nonetheless, I think there's a good point there, which is, what's the relationship with Europe like? I started off with my rather crass point about Beethoven, but I make that point because I'm about to go to this thing called the European Cultural Parliament on Thursday, where I'm going to be meeting lots of people from the arts from Europe, but they're not all in the EU. And actually, it's not about the EU, and we're all going to talk about the arts and Europe, and we're not going to all obsessively talk about the EU. However, the organiser said to me, there is a problem, which is that people think the British contingent are, that Britain's gone racist, right? So, and that, we don't know what to do about it. So I pointed out that at the first event that we had here, that 3 of the Brexit supporting speakers who were artists on the panel were from ethnic minority backgrounds, who they pointed out that actually 1 million people voted from ethnic minority backgrounds voted Brexit. Now, I don't want to do the kind of, what colour were you? But when I said that to someone, they said, oh my God, but I thought it was all the alt-right fascists in Britain And so we were wondering if you'd come and talk to the audience about why Britain has become fascist. And I said, I voted Brexit, just in case any of you hadn't worked that bit out. And I said, in the spirit of Tony Benn, if you want to know, and because I'm a Democrat on the left, and because I'm a European anti-racist, got nothing to do with anything else, right? So, I wouldn't mind explaining that. And they were so shocked. So I think that, there's a problem, which is that we're frightening our artistic, cultural and educational peers in Europe into thinking that there's pogroms on every street corner in this country. And most of my mates voted Remain. And most of my mates do not think there are racist pogroms and are rather embarrassed about the fact that there's a small group of people who are making out that everything's about to collapse. So I think that in that sense, I'd like to move things forward. And I think in that spirit, the idea of these discussions was to sort of have a conversation about how the arts can be involved in that conversation in a different and new way. Because although Vicky can say, well, I'm fed up, lots of people aren't saying that. People have said, I don't know anyone who says that. The reason why these discussions got organised was because so many high-profile people in the arts were in the media quoted as saying, we are abhorred at the fact that Britain has taken this right-wing, fascistic, nationalist turn, and this is terrible, and we in the arts are going to try and stop it. And that's what led to these kind of discussions emerging, and secret Brexit arts types approaching clandestinely and saying, actually, I don't want you to tell anyone, but I voted Brexit, by the way. And then we discovered there was a world of people in the arts who did vote Brexit, but they didn't want anyone to know because they were their peers.
Yeah, can I respond
to
that?
Yes, you can respond to that. Yes, I was just trying to get a bit of kind of, yes. You can. Use first, then you, and then the person on the back row after that.
Well, yeah, no, the reason I didn't respond to it was because when I saw what happened the next day, when I saw all the reams of social media in this absolute kind of cacophony of accusation and you're racist, you're fascist, you're sexist, how on earth am I going to say, well actually, and actually that reaction even confirmed to me that I did the right thing. Because I was completely isolated. Other than my father, who was very, very staunchly Brexit, and he's a Syrian refugee who came in the 70s with nothing. And he's completely changed my worldview, actually. Because he said to me, I don't want to destroy the nation state. And this is what it comes down to. You don't have to destroy the nation state to be left wing, okay? Some people actually really value the history of this country and actually really like the nation state. So, and for him, he always wanted to integrate into it. First thing when he came here in the 70s, he only spoke Arabic, and then he just learned English by going to Whitechapel Library and did a dictionary. And he loves Britain, and he wants to be in an environment where he can stand up and say, I love my country, I love Britain. And I love my father, and I really responded to that. But, for both of us, it's been this journey for a whole year where we only kind of talk to each other secretly and, but yeah, sorry.
I just want to say that I don't want this argument to feel as though an artist is only reflective of, the leavers if they voted leave. That's not, that's, I don't think that's what we're saying. But there is a critique on artists. And the reason why the critique exists and why we're all here today, I think, and why most of us in the cultural sector did wake up the next day and thought, how did that happen? It's exactly that question. It's how is it that we were so surprised? If we are supposed to be the people that reflect the voices of the people around us, if that's the charge, that's the responsibility almost of our work. As a sector, not individually, but as a sector. And so I suppose what I'm saying is that if we don't represent those voices, and if those voices don't get an airing, then it's easy for racists to come and exploit it. And that's exactly how racism, fascism has flourished historically. So it's not saying that, the 96% doesn't tally with the 52%, and that's why there's a problem. It's rather the 96% haven't yet got to terms with giving the 52% their voice alongside them, and having that debate about what does immigration mean for Englishness, what does integration mean for Englishness. It's all right for you in Islington, but when refugees come, it's me that's waiting in the GP surgery, or they don't know how to queue up on the bus. These are all, they might sound really petty, or, why are you being so condescending? But these are actually the issues that matter to those people. These are the concerns that are arising again and again. And I can point you to the research if you want me to.
Okay, thank you. So I've got that person in the back row. All right, okay.
I think we need a new political art for the times that we're in, and I did think that I liked I read your thing, Avi. So I thought it was good. I think that we do have a problem with the fact that artists today, and I'm an artist, there's a lot of said that you can't tell artists what to do, they have to follow their muse, and, society shouldn't tell artists what to do. I do think that artists today, a lot of them who are socially committed, feel they have to do something, but the way that they feel they have to do something is, as I think Angus was trying to point out, they feel that they have to expose injustice by showing where we're still divided. And I think that's not what we need today. I think I went to a discussion recently in Deptford. I've just moved down to Deptford from Birmingham, and there was a meeting of Deptford community artists talking about work in the community and what they'd been doing. And they, apart from the fact that most of the discussion was about the difficulty of finding studio space for artists in London, the rest of the discussion, the only examples the speakers could use of art that they were doing to engage with the community was one, which was a project on slavery and the history of slavery in Deptford, and two, a photographic exhibition that a speaker was organising at Goldsmiths at the time, which was about the New Cross fire in 1978, where a bunch of black teenagers were killed in an arson attack. And it seems to me that we need something, a different kind of art that isn't about that. And Kenneth Clark said something good a while ago, which was that civilizations can be destroyed by the loss of self-confidence just as effectively as they can be by bombs. I think that today humanity has lost its nerve and lost faith in itself, and human beings are very much underrated. And I've said this, I have a favourite quote, which some of you may have heard before, but I think that this is something that's completely forgotten by artists these days, especially the ones that want to make a difference in the world. David Hockney said once that the world is full of tragedy and horror. It's very true, but the world is also full of beauty and amazing, wonderful things, and the job of the artist is to be a counsel against despair, and that's the kind of art we need today after Brexit, to bring artists and people in Europe and Britain together, black and white in Britain too.
Thank you.
Mine's the what's new question. There's a very good book by Peter Carey, The Intellectuals and the Masses, where he looks at the kind of the expression of a elitist contempt for the masses, and kind of eugenic and even exterminationist contempt expressed by H.G. Wells and and other authors writing in the 1930s, and I definitely recognise what Miriam was talking about in terms of the contempt that's been expressed for ordinary people through the referendum discussion and post-referendum discussion. But obviously, I don't want to kind of generalise that and say that that's all artists. But certainly at the kind of elite level, I think we have to acknowledge that those views were expressed both in the past and more recently. And I guess my question is, is it a case that this just hasn't gone away and it's just a continuity, and we shouldn't be surprised by that, or is there something genuinely new there?
Yes, I'm just wondering about whether artists are. I'm very interested in what Vicky was saying about artists working in their time and being of their time, and I do wonder whether one of the problems that artists face these days is one of being over-politicized, that their world has become overly political. And there's a kind of expectation, and I think it is an expectation that's sort of like grown up particularly over the last 30 years, but maybe it's gone on longer. I mean, and it's changed. But there is this kind of expectation that artists should, at some level, if not take a political view, at least take a social view, that there's a sense of social responsibility that have been engendered within the arts, particularly around, for example, the funding for the arts and the way the funders operate. Because it's very difficult to get funding for arts unless you can show that you are have some sense of social responsibility. And I think the social responsibility and political thinking are very closely allied. So I do wonder whether one of the problems that artists face these days is that they have been politicized, whether or not they, innately or originally or whatever, want to do art that's political. It's almost like art that's not political is kind of pushed to one side and really not taken seriously. And so there's that kind of pressure on them, and that becomes a problem in these discussions about Europe and Brexit, where they're expected to stand up and say something where, maybe they shouldn't.
Okay. Right. Thank you. Sorry. Yes, it's here, and then there. Yeah.
Yeah. I suppose I get a bit worried when I hear people call for the idea of we need a new political art, because it just seems to me that what we really need is just good art. Full stop. No political about it. Just good art. Because it might be true, as the lady said over there, that art in some way diminished teenage pregnancies, although I find it quite difficult to believe. But you can be pretty sure that art that set out to diminish teenage pregnancies would be pretty terrible art. And I just think that it's the same with Brexit. Art that sort of self-consciously sets out to overcome Brexit divisions or cultural divides or whatever will be bad art, and that'll be a real problem. So I suppose my question is, to the panel, is how can we argue for just good art? What is the argument that needs to clinch that?
No. Right, okay, so I've got in the back, only because we've got a hurry now. Right, I'm trying to get everyone in, yeah.
Just quickly, I thought, democracy in the arts in Europe. Bring it back to Europe. Here is the moment in time where, art could become actually truly international at the moment, because, believe it or not, the whole of Europe hates the EU. It's not just Brexit. Come on. Now you can just reach out and have a greater artistic movement with all these, especially Greece, those of artists who actually hate the EU. Yeah. This is the unifying bit that we have at the moment. Britain can become much cooler than Berlin, because Berlin artists are idiots at the moment. Come on, I'm just making it, all the artists here. Seize the moment, become international. This is the political moment, and I think art can be made. Do it.
Quite funny. Right, okay. Okay, so where's that person gone? Oh, yes, so the person over there. Yeah, sorry, right.
My point, right? I just think...
Speak into the microphone.
Yeah, sorry. As a moment of caution, I think we should, all sentences with art is or art should make it a common mistake, which is that art is a subject with a common point of view. And in fact, what we're talking about is tens of thousands of different people all doing different things, that you couldn't say it should be this or should be that, it should obey this law or that law. It's surprising how little art is about politics. I mean, it's astonishing just how many times people pick up a pen, either in words or colour or whatever they're working in, and are not thinking about politics or society even at all, but rhythm and metre or colour or shade or all these things. So it's really quite a small part of what the arts is concerned with is a question of politics. And an even smaller part, I suspect, is concerned necessarily with Brexit or Remain. And artists are very bad in the main at choosing political ideals. We're very keen on Tony Blair, I seem to remember. And then they all fell out of love with him in a moment. It was shocking. And then in 2010, there were really big artists campaign for the Liberal Democrats. There was quite a big campaign to get artists to vote for the Liberal Democrats. In the 1930s, Ezra Pound and Wyndham Lewis were signed-up Nazis. Wyndham Lewis wrote a book about how brilliant Hitler was, which was quite commonplace in the 1930s. Artists, surprise, surprise, are not necessarily the people that you should ask about politics. Just like you wouldn't necessarily ask George Bush about painting. They're good at art, by and large, but not, there's no special insight, in my experience, into the world of politics.
Just on the, I think what the value of these kind of events are, just to say, it doesn't matter why this happened, it did happen. On two panels before the referendum that I was on, one a literary panel and another a political panel, very well-known people on the panel said, does anyone here know anyone who's voting Brexit? and I said, I'm voting Brexit, and they all laughed because they thought I was doing a self-parody. And that's what happened, right? And so that was a kind of weird experience, because I genuinely was shocked, right? Not that there wasn't anyone in the room that was, it doesn't matter about that. It was the fact that it was almost like, does anyone know who these people are? And I do think that sort of sense of, do we know what country we live in? This is nothing to do with the arts, it's to do with citizens, right? Is that I do think that knowing the kind of country that we live in, it might be worth our while, and not caricaturing both sides. Obviously, this now applies in all possible ways. But actually, I did think that Kate Tempest is a very fine performance, a poet whose politics I don't agree with at all. But I did think that kind of listen harder injuncture this morning was quite appropriate. It seems to me that one should listen harder, that way we might actually start to understand the kind of country that we live in, and not caricature our fellow citizens one way or another and try and understand what's happening. Some people think it's very exciting, some people are a bit more worried about it, but it's definitely a bit more than a kind of newspaper headline. And then the final thing was just on the question of the Greece thing, and this is, I think that this is a genuine concern, was when I was invited to speak at an event on arts and politics, and there had been a huge amount of money invested in giving Greek artists a voice. And at the debate around that exhibition, it appeared that although it was about giving Greek artists a voice, it was because what Greek artists need to do is to have a voice to tell people the importance of European unity in a period of pressure. And this was a few years ago when there was some concern that Greece would leave. I argued against the instrumentalizing of Greek artists in this way, and I was attacked as being anti-European and xenophobic and all the rest of it. But what was fascinating was that the people who supported me after this row broke out were the Greek artists, who basically said, actually, we just wanted our art to be exhibited, and we didn't really want to do it under the auspice of that, but that was the exhibition that's touring as we speak. I don't think they created rubbish art because they had this instrumental demand, but I do think there was a tyranny that they had to pretend that the artwork they were creating fitted into a certain framework. And I don't think that arts should be treated as a battering ram for any political argument. I think that's, I think not only because they're not necessarily any good at politics, but for all the reasons that people have said. So I hope that the artists here won't see this as an attempt at saying artists should be one politics or another. But it is interesting to think about what the arts represent in terms of the changing public opinion that we've got in the UK at the moment. So I think in reverse order, I'm just going to get the panel to kind of give us their final thoughts on the issue. So.
Cool. I think two thoughts, really. One of them is, I remember 3 years ago or so, maybe 5 years ago, people saying the arts weren't political enough, and now suddenly the arts are too political. I've got no idea where I stand on this, except that I know it's a feature. It's not all of it, but it's a feature. Sometimes, according to the times around it, it's increased and sometimes decreased. But also, I think coming down to the point of, how do we make art about Brexit that's good art? I don't think the question is making art about Brexit. I totally agree with the gentleman over there and the gentleman over there. Artists will carry on, hopefully, making art, and we just hope that it'll be good art. My question is that, or rather my concern, is that, from my own experience, I know that if you belong to a particular community, an identifiable community, seeing your stories shared with yourselves, that going to see your stories reflected back to you, and also with other people who don't belong to your community, is a massively powerful thing. It's it's integration done for you almost. It's like, oh look, I shared myself with you. And my concerns were then voiced. Oh, I don't have to, it's a weight that's lifted off your shoulders. And similarly, not seeing it is massively restrictive and quite dangerous. Because then it's an implosion that occurs, and implosions inevitably explode. So I'm not saying that artists should go out and create Brexit art. I'm saying that those voices and those stories that have been missing from our stages and galleries shouldn't be missing anymore. We need to hear them because we're at the verge, I think, of that implosion exploding.
Slightly harsh maybe on George Bush. I'm not sure which one you mean. One of them's quite an accomplished painter, as I think, but maybe not such a good politician. Maybe it works both ways. I think I definitely agree with the point, though, that the arts shouldn't be in the business of trying to do things to people. And I don't think they can successfully anyway. I don't think they can bridge cultural divides. Not in any straightforward way. They might be able to reflect them for better or worse. I think there are very real cultural divides in contemporary society. There are ongoing cultural wars which are increasingly playing themselves out on the sort of battlegrounds of our major cities, whether they're London, Nice, Paris, or Berlin. And I think it's ridiculous to imagine that the arts can tell people to obey the law or to be not racist, because the flip side of that, the arts telling people to be racist or to drive suicide trucks across Westminster Bridge is equally ridiculous. And both positions are ridiculous and reflect each other. I think what the arts community most broadly might want to reflect on is the extent to which I think that they are part of a sort of shared rejection of ourselves, of ideas of belonging, of a shared narrative that people used to have and have rejected that in favour of exclusive, as it happens, narrow identity narratives. And to bring this back to Europe, the arts, writers, playwrights, musicians, philosophers across Europe have talked to each other historically, and they talked to each other about things they agreed on, and they didn't talk to each other about so much about things that, or not directly, or maybe not in such a sort of comradely way. They didn't talk to each other so much about things that they didn't agree on, and maybe I was sort of saying that artists might just reflect on that part of it, might start talking to people who agree with them more than they seek to try and convince people who don't agree with them to agree with them. I think it might just be more productive to form a sort of new exclusivity. So, I don't know, a contemporary form of Stuckists, for example, who might be interested in anti-nationalism. I mean, that might be anti-nationalism. Yeah, I think it might be a productive terrain for reflection to say, why has there been just this conformist move to be anti-nationalist? Might anti-nationalism be might be richer or more problematic? So difficult terrain, I think, but I think finding some things that we can that speak to our shared experience just might be more profitable than always trying to break with what we recognise. And in so doing, we might find it that there are people in Europe, not just in Britain, who live in similar societies and recognise what we're saying in the different ways. And that's where I would leave. I think there's always a tension in art that I certainly can't resolve between the universal and the particular. But, people have their unique experience on the world, and if they rigorously and through lots of hard work over years express that, they might find that some people recognise in a way that's bigger than their own particularity.
I'll end by saying, no, I do think there is a disconnect between artists and reality in that for a long period of time, I know this may sound very old-fashioned, but drawing and painting is a very important connection, the eye, the hand, and looking at what is actually going on around you in the streets, in your local community, around, nowadays they teach art from a very young age. The national curriculum teaches them to look at other artists, constantly looking at other artists, which is good because it broadens your cultural horizons. But that's literally all they do. They copy and copy and copy. And as a result, a lot of it is sort of manner. Everything is a reflection of something that's come before. When I went around the National Gallery last year, I felt like that could have been done in the 60s, that could have been done in the 80s, that could have been done in the 50s, but very little of it actually connected to what was going on right here, right now. And even though they say they do, that connection is not there anymore. And that needs to be rebuilt. And I think that's actually, there's a lot of beauty in that, and perhaps a lot of optimism in it as well. So that needs to be kind of readdressed, if you want. And was it the woman at the back that was saying about connecting with the whole world rather than just Europe? Was that? Yeah, anywhere that I completely agree with that as well. Yeah, so that was beautifully phrased.
We're incredibly lucky that we have this human condition, this itch, this drive, this absolute necessity to create stuff. It's fundamentally important to us as human beings, and I really hope that we continue to be able to celebrate that in all of us. And I hope in the future there will be far more access for those people who are currently denied the opportunities that we've been talking about throughout. It's run like a thread throughout the conversation today about a feeling of exclusion and denial. And in the world that I come from of arts and creativity, I really hope and trust that we can resolve this. For goodness sake, it's not that hard. We're one of the richest countries in the world, and we shouldn't have to sit and accept these sort of situations amongst a group of people who are all so close together. I hope by the time we get to 2028, some extraordinary pieces of art will have been created that we in this room will all have experienced. It'll make us think slightly differently about the world. I think that's what art does. I don't believe it's political, but I think it's there to make you feel different. And whether it's taking a photograph of your mum or posting up the thing your kid did on the fridge, that's just as important as looking at great art. Thank you.